Hello. So here's what I'm doing today is I am going to be trying to research what's going on in Afghanistan. So I'm not 100% sure how this is going to work, but we're just going to try things. How about chat timestamps, participants? How do I show my stream? Show your screen on YouTube. How to record the screen, upload to YouTube. Click screen share and choose a desktop window that you want to record the screencast. Click start screen share to start the screen. I think what I'm going to do is I'm probably just going to Google some stuff and then I'll pop it in the chat. So again, I'm going to be trying to research Afghanistan. The first thing I'm going to be trying to look for is just a timeline of events. This will probably be really boring content, but boring content is better than no content. So right now I'm Googling Afghanistan timeline. Anytime that I look at a link, I'll throw it in the chat, at least for my benefit, so I know what I'm reading. Okay, so this is just the very first thing I looked up when I typed in when I looked up Afghanistan timeline. Start. Okay. October 15th, 1999, and Al-Qaeda and Taliban nexus. Also, I'm going to be writing some stuff down. Philosophy and politics. The first big thing I'm trying to do is just get like a timeline of events. Hopefully I can do that. Pulling up the appropriate Google Drive. I don't have a folder yet for Afghanistan, so let's make one. New folder. Afghanistan. And then new Google Doc. And new Google Doc. I'm going to make one of these sources, and then another one of these is going to be the timeline. All right. This computer is working really slow right now. It's going incredibly slowly with the computer. Okay, October 15th, 1999, an Al-Qaeda and Taliban nexus. The United Nations Security Council adopts Resolution 1267, creating the so-called Al-Qaeda and Taliban Sanctions Committee, which links the two groups as terrorist entities and imposes sanctions on their funding, travel, and arms shipments. The UN move follows a period of ascendancy for Al-Qaeda and its leader Osama bin Laden, who guided the terror group from Afghanistan and Peshawar, Pakistan in the late 1980s to Sudan in 1991 and back to Afghanistan in mid-1990s. The Taliban, which rose from the ashes of Afghanistan's post-Soviet civil war, provide Al-Qaeda sanctuary for operations. Okay. All right, so that's probably a pretty important date to have on the timeline here. So we're going to have, this is 1999. And then let's put that size bigger and in bold. And then this is specifically October 15th. I guess it's also important to note, I'm getting this from CFR. I don't know what CFR is, so this could be a bad website. What is CFR.org? Okay, just CFR then. So this is the Council on Foreign Relations. So again, I'm not 100% sure how reliable the source is. Okay, it looks like it is a United States nonprofit think tank specializing in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs, headquartered in New York City with an additional office in Washington, D.C. Its membership, which has many members. President Richard N. Nass. Okay, and then so who is Richard N. Nass? American diplomat. He's been president since approved Haas as a candidate for the position of ambassador, and he has been U.S. coordinator for the future of Afghanistan. He has succeeded. Okay. In office. So it looks like George W. Bush was in office. Okay, so right off the bat, so then I'm going to put like bias, American / conservative question mark, because it looks like he was under George W. Bush. That doesn't mean this is like the worst source, but it's always, I mean, everything has its bias. It's good to know what those biases are. So it looks like the bias here is just like American and maybe a little conservative. So it's good to know that. Okay. September 9th, 2001, a Northern Alliance assassination. Ahmad Shah Massoud, commander of the Northern Alliance, an anti-Taliban coalition, is assassinated by al-Qaeda operatives. The killing of Mossad, a master of guerrilla warfare known as the Lion of Panjshir, deals a serious blow to the anti-Taliban resistance. Terrorism experts believe his assassination assured Osama bin Laden protection by the Taliban after the 9/11 attacks. Expert Peter Bergen later calls Mossad's assassination the curtain raiser for the attacks in New York City and Washington, D.C. Okay. So I've never heard of this guy, so it's probably pretty good to know about this guy, I guess. So 2001, That's what's going on. Bold. Okay, so then we've got September 11, 2001. Okay. Minor break while I go get food. Actually, I'll just leave it running for like another minute here. I can always edit that part out. What? No, just found stuff. All right, brought back steak. It's pretty good. And my timeline broke. And it crashed again for reasons unknown. I'm doing research, okay? Listen, I'm doing it. I promise. I'm just also eating steak. And also, my links keep breaking. So I already threw a link in the chat. I'll throw it again, so you know where I'm at. Okay, so that's the link I'm working from. And then I'll also link the timeline that I'm working on. 1 second here, so you can see what I'm doing. If it ever loads. There we go. Okay, copy link. Okay, this is the primary thing I'm working on right now. It's just like a research document. So right now I'm at about September 9th. So again, the big takeaways I'm having right now is that on September 9th, it looks like the Taliban killed this guy. And this was a little bit, it seemed like it was at least part of the catalyst for the September 11 attacks because Osama bin Laden believed that he would be protected afterward. Okay. So obviously then we have September 11, and we have the September 11 attack. Okay, Al-Qaeda operatives hijacked 4 commercial airliners, crashing them into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A 4th plane crashes in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Close to 3,000 people died in the attacks, although Afghanistan is the base for Al-Qaeda. None of the 19 hijackers are Afghan nationals. Mohammed Atta, an Egyptian, led the group, and 15 of the hijackers ranged from Saudi Arabia. President George W. Bush vows to win the war against terrorism and later zeroes in on Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. Bush eventually calls on the Taliban regime to deliver to the United States authorities and all the leaders of Al-Qaeda who live in your land or share in their faith. Okay, so I think another document I'm going to make is just like a list of sort of key players and like what their various roles were. So that, you know, as we see names that are recurring, we know who they're talking about. I'll throw this in there as well as soon as it loads. Okay, so going back through the timeline here that we're reading, and then writing down a couple key players as we go through. So we've got the United Nations Security Council. All right, and then what is the involvement of the United Nations Security Council? They adopted that October 15th, 1999. Period of ascendancy for Al-Qaeda and its leader Osama bin Laden. So one thing that I'm going to be interested in while I do this research is what exactly is the link between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Okay, so next up, I want to put down the Taliban. Okay. So then in September 9th, we have Ahmad Shah Massoud. Is another key player in this. Commander of the Northern Alliance and Anti-Taliban Coalition. He was assassinated by Al-Qaeda operatives. The Killing of Masood, a master of guerrilla warfare, known as the Lion of Panjshir, deals a series blow to the anti-Taliban resistance. Okay, so I'm not 100% sure what Lion of Panjshir means. What exactly they're referencing there? Is that the guy? Ahmad Shah Massoud. Okay, so that's the same guy. Okay, yeah. So he was called the Lion of the Panjshir. So okay, so it's saying that he's a master of guerrilla warfare. What else we got here? Terrorism experts believe his assassination assured Osama bin Laden protection by the Taliban after the 9/11 attacks. Expert Peter Bergen later calls Massoud's assassination the curtain raiser of the attacks in New York City and Washington, D.C. Okay. September 11th, Al-Qaeda operatives hijacked 4 commercial airliners, crashing them into the World Trade Center in New York and Pentagon. All right, so what do we know from that? Okay, so that means that Al-Qaeda was the ones who did September 11th. Okay. Although Afghanistan is the base for Al-Qaeda, so which we kind of already knew. Okay, so because again, following that little timeline, so right now Al-Qaeda is back in Afghanistan. None of the hijackers are Afghanistan nationals. Mohammed Atta, an Egyptian, led the group, and 15 of the hijackers originated from Saudi Arabia. President George W. Bush vows to win the war against terrorism. Later, it was an Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. Bush eventually calls on the Taliban regime to deliver to the United States authorities all the leaders of Al-Qaeda who hide in your land or share in their fate. Okay. This is still 2001. So this was, for context, this was 1 week later. And the timeline broke again. So we're refreshing it again. Okay, there we go. All right, so At this point, we are involved in the war in Afghanistan. One sec. All right. Steak is gone. So now we get serious. We're still pretty serious. October 7th, 2001, the opening salvo of the U.S. military with British support begins a bombing campaign against Taliban forces. Officially launching Operation Enduring Freedom, Canada, Australia, Germany, and France pledged further support. The war's early phase, PDF, mainly involved U.S. airstrikes and Al-Qaeda and Taliban forces that are assisted by a partnership of about 1,000 U.S. Special Forces, the Northern Alliance, and ethnic Pashtun anti-Taliban forces. Did I write down anything about the Northern Alliance yet? Oh, okay. So this is the Northern Alliance. That's the group that Ahmed Shah Massoud was part of. So again, this is the Northern Front. The first wave of conventional ground forces arrives 12 days later. Most of the ground combat is between the Taliban and its Afghan opponents. Okay. And I'm sure that this got resolved very quickly, and there was very little bloodshed. Oops. All right. Oh, it actually has it by year. How long do I want to stay in 2001 for? Like, I don't really know how much of this I really need to talk about things going on today. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try to just go through this all fairly quickly. Okay, the Taliban regime unravels rapidly after its loss at Mazar-e-Sharif on November 9, 2001, and forces loyal to Abdul Rashid Dastum, an ethnic Uzbek military leader. Over the next week, Taliban strongholds crumble after coalition and Northern Alliance offensives on Talakwan, Bamiyan, Herat, Kabul, and Jalalabad. On November 14th, 2001, the UN Security Force Council passes Resolution 1378, calling for a central role for the United Nations establishing a transitional administration, inviting member states to send peacekeeping forces to promote stability and aid delivery. Okay. I should keep putting this in. All right, one more brief intervention while I go use the restroom, and then we're going to keep diving into this. Oh, I have a text. All right, what else we got? All right, I'll just put it on the timeline. Actually, do I really need to put it on the timeline? Because otherwise I feel like this timeline is literally just going to be all just events from here. I'm at least going to make it a little bit different. Let's bring up a Google Sheet. Okay, well, I'll just at least write down some key names and facts. But again, the biggest thing I'm interested in is what connection does this have to Biden and Biden's administration? Okay, so this guy's an ethnic Uzbek Uzbek military leader. Control C. Okay, so they lost at Mazar-e-Sharif. Okay, so Taliban forces lose to Mazar-e-Sharif, crumble after coalition and Northern Alliance offensives on Taloqan. There's Bamiyan. There's Herat. There is Kabul, which I'm pretty sure is the capital. And there is Jalalabad. On November 14th, 2011, the UN Security passes calling for a central role for the United States in establishing a transitional government. Okay. Okay, so I'll put this people to know. This is the United States Security Council again. Shift, Control V. Bin Laden escapes, December 2001. After tracking al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden to the well-equipped Tora Bora cave complex southeast of Kabul, Afghan militias engage in fierce two-week battle with al-Qaeda militants. It results in a few hundred deaths and the eventual escape of bin Laden, who is thought to have left for Pakistan on horseback on December 16th, just a day before Afghan forces captured 20 of his remaining men. Despite intelligence pointing to bin Laden's presence in Tora Bora, U.S. forces do not lead the assault, which is carried out by a ragtag Afghan contingent led by Hazrat Ali, Haji Zaman, and Haji Zahir. Some critics will later question why U.S. forces did not take a more assertive role in the engagement. Okay, so these three guys right now are, these are Afghanis, and they led the forces in Tora Bora. Okay, what else? An interim government. So December 5th, 2001, after the fall of Kabul in November 2001, the United Nations invites major Afghan factions, most prominently the Northern Alliance, and a group led by the former king, but not the Taliban, to a conference in Bonn, Germany. On December 5th, 2001, the factions signed the Bonn Agreement, endorsed by UN Security Council Resolution 1383. The agreement reportedly reached with substantial Iranian diplomatic help because of Iran's support for the Northern Alliance faction, installs Hamid Karzai as interim administration head and creates an international peacekeeping force to maintain security in Kabul. The Bonn Agreement is followed by UN Security Council Resolution 1386 on December 20th, which establishes the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF. Okay, so what are the big takeaways here? Here. So I'm just going to write down all of this under a couple of people. So first of all, how is the United Nations helping? So on December 5th, the faction signed the Bonn Agreement, endorsed by the UN Security Council. The agreement reportedly reached was installs Hamid Karzai. Actually, I'm just going to copy this whole thing. As interim administration head, creates an international key force to maintain security in Kabul. Okay, so now we've got this new figure. So we've got this guy as interim head. Okay, so December 9th, 2001, the Taliban collapses. The end of the Taliban regime is generally tied to this date when the Taliban surrender Kandahar on the PDF. Okay, so Kandahar is another city. Kandahar. Kandahar, okay. And Taliban leader Mullah Omar flees the city, leaving it under tribal law administered by Pashtun leaders. Despite the official fall of the Taliban, however, Al-Qaeda leaders continue to hide out in the mountains. Okay, so let me copy some of that down. So this guy is a Taliban leader. Leaving it under the tribal law administered by the Pashtun leaders. Despite the official fall of the Taliban, however, Al-Qaeda leaders continue to fight out in the mountains. March 2002, mixed signals. Operation Anaconda, the first major ground assault and the largest operation since Tora Bora, is launched against an estimated 800 Al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters in the Shah-e-Kot Valley south of the city of Gardez. Okay. Nearly 2,000 U.S. and 1,000 Afghan troops battle the militants. Despite the operation's size, however, Anaconda does not represent a broadening of the war effort. Instead, Pentagon planners began shifting military intelligence sources away from Afghanistan in the direction of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which is increasingly mentioned as a chief U.S. threat in the war on terror. Okay, so this is where Saddam Hussein enters the picture. Reconstructing Afghanistan. President George W. Bush calls for the reconstruction of Afghanistan in a speech at the Virginia Military Institute. By helping to build an Afghanistan that's free from this evil and is a better place in which to live, we are working the best traditions of George Marshall, he says, evoking the post-World War II Marshall Plan that revived Western Europe. But the United States and the international community do not come close to Marshall Plan-like reconstruction spending for Afghanistan. The U.S. Congress appropriates over $38 billion in humanitarian and reconstruction assistance to Afghanistan from 2001 to 2009. Okay, so actually this might be an important number later. Transitional government named. Hamid Karzai, chairman of Afghanistan's interim administration since December 2001, is picked to head the country's transitional government. Okay. His selection comes during an emergency Loya Jirga assembled in Kabul, attended by 15,050 delegates, including about 200 women, from Afghanistan's 364 districts. Okay, let me write that down. Karzai, leader of the powerful Papalzai tribe of Durrani Pashtuns, returned to Afghanistan from Pakistan after 9/11 to organize Pashtun resistance to the Taliban. Okay, it's good to know. Some observers allege Karzai tolerates corruption by members of his clan and his government. The Northern Alliance, dominated by... So just go ahead and write that down real quick. Okay, so now we're back to the Northern Alliance. Where's Northern Alliance? Or I'm sorry, Northern Front? Northern Alliance. Have I already talked about the Northern Alliance? Did I write down Northern Front incorrectly? Oh, yeah, I did write it down incorrectly. Okay, so this, I think, is supposed to be Alliance then. Okay. Right, I think. Yeah, because I haven't seen anything about anything called the Northern Front, only the Northern Alliance. Okay. Okay, the Northern Alliance dominated by ethnic Tajiks. And my people to know link just died. It'd be really, really cool and make things a lot easier to research if my stuff kept didn't die every couple minutes here. That would be actually really cool, I think. Okay. Fails in its effort to set up a prime ministership, but does succeed in checking presidential powers by assigning major authorities to the elected parliament, such as the power to veto senior nominees and to impeach a president. Okay, so these guys seemed really pivotal in establishing the original government. So basically, they seemed pretty democratic, but they kind of failed in setting things up to be good for them. Establishing a reconstruction model. The U.S. military creates a civil affairs framework to coordinate redevelopment with UN and non-governmental organizations and to expand the authority of the Kabul government. These so-called provincial reconstruction teams, or PRTs, creates a civil affairs framework. Stood up first in Gradez in November, followed by the Kunduz, Marzi Sharif, Kandahar, and Herat. Command for individual PRTs is eventually handed over to NATO states. While credited with improving security for aid agencies, the model is not universally praised. Concern mounts that the PRT system lacks central controlling authority, is disorganized, and creates what the U.S. Institute of Peace reports call an ad hoc approach to security and development. Such criticisms grow beyond the PRT program and becomes a common theme in the NATO war effort as a maze of what's that say? As a maze of national kavatsi restricts the activities of member forces. Critics contend this limits the coalition's effectiveness. Okay. May 1st, 2003, major combat over. During a briefing with reporters in Kabul, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declares an end to major combat. The announcement coincides with President George W. Bush's mission accomplished declaration of an end to fighting in Iraq. Rumsfeld says President Bush, U.S. Central Command Chief General Tommy Franks, and Afghan President Hamid Karzai have concluded that we are at the point where we clearly have moved from major combat activity to a period of stability and stabilization and reconstruction activities. There are only 8,000 U.S. soldiers stationed in Afghanistan. It is predicted that the transition from combat to reconstruction will open the door for many aid organizations, particularly European groups, that had balked at sending troops, supplies, or other assistance. An international mission. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization assumes control of international security forces in Afghanistan. The North Atlantic assumes control of international security forces in Afghanistan, expanding NATO ISAF's role across the country. It is NATO's first operational commitment outside of Europe. Originally tasked with securing Kabul and its surrounding areas, NATO expands in September 2005, July 2006, and October 2006. The number of ISAF groups grows accordingly from an initial 5,000 to around 65,000 troops from 42 countries, including all 28 NATO member states. In 2006, ISAF assumes command of the international military forces in eastern Afghanistan from the US-led coalition and also becomes more involved in intensive combat operations in southern Afghanistan. A constitution for Afghanistan. An assembly of 502 Afghan delegates agrees on a constitution for Afghanistan, creating a strong presidential system intended to unite the country's various ethnic groups. The act is seen as a positive step toward democracy. Afghans have seized the opportunity provided by the U.S. and its international partners to lay the foundation for democratic institutions and provide a framework for national elections, declares U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan Zalmay Khalilzad. Okay, so I'm going to write him down. October 9th, 2004. In historical national balloting, Karzai becomes the first democratically elected head of Afghanistan. Okay, so he also won the first democratically elected. So he also became the first democratically elected head. Okay. First dem. Voters turn out in high numbers despite threats of violence and intimidation. Karzai wins with 55% of the vote, which while his closest rival, former education minister Yonis Kanuni, pulls 16%. So, all right, so he wins a huge amount of the vote, basically. 55% of vote versus, what was it, 16%? Karzai's election victory is marred by accusations of fraud by his opponents and by the kidnapping of 3 foreign UN election workers by a militant group. But the election is nonetheless held as a victory for the fragile nation. Afghans had not gone to the polls since 1969, when they cast ballots in parliamentary elections during the reign of King Mohammad Zahir Shah. Okay, so let's go ahead and write this down at least. Maybe there's good reason to believe he wasn't so nice. And by the kidnapping of 3 foreign UN, okay. Bin Laden surfaces, I should say, not resurfaces. Signaling the persistent challenges facing the U.S.-led coalition in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden releases a videotape message 3 weeks after the country's presidential election and just days before the U.S. polls in which George W. Bush will win re-election. In remarks aired on the Arab television network Al Jazeera, bin Laden taunts the Bush administration and takes responsibility for the attacks of September 11, 2001. We want to restore freedom to our nation, just as you lay waste to our nation. We want to restore freedom to our nation, just as you lay waste to our nation, bin Laden says. Okay, so bin Laden's back. An enduring U.S. commitment. Afghan President Hamid Karzai and U.S. President George W. Bush issue a joint declaration that pronounces their respective countries' strategic partners. The declaration gives U.S. forces access to Afghan military facilities to prosecute the war against international terror and the struggle against violent extremism. The alliance's goal, the agreement says, is to strengthen U.S. Afghan ties and to help ensure Afghanistan's long-term security, democracy, and prosperity. Moreover, the agreement calls for Washington to help organize, train, equip, and sustain Afghan security forces as Afghanistan develops the capacity to undertake this responsibility and to continue to rebuild the country's economy and political democracy. Democracy and Afghanistan. More than 6 million Afghans turned out to vote for the Wolisai Zhurga Council of People, the Mejrano Zhurga Council of Elders, and local councils. Considered the most democratic elections ever in Afghanistan, nearly half those casting ballots are women, viewed as a sign of political progress in a highly patriarchal and conservative society. 68 out of 249 seats are set aside for female members of Afghanistan's lower house of parliament, and 23 out of 102 are reserved for the upper house. Okay. So the big takeaway out here is I'm going to write down just those two houses. A bloody resurgence. Violence increases across the country during the summer months, with intense fighting erupting in the south in July. The number of suicide attacks quintuples from 27 to 139, while remotely detonated bombings more than double to 1,677. Despite a string of recent election successes, some experts blame a faltering central government for the spike in attacks. As with most insurgencies, the critical precondition to the Afghan insurgency is the collapse of governance, says Afghanistan expert Seth G. Jones. Jones and other experts point to the many Afghans who lack basic services, the government's difficulty setting up its police forces, and the lack of international forces to assist with security. Cracks in the coalition. At the NATO summit in Riga, rifts emerge among member states on a troop commitments to Afghanistan. NATO Secretary General Jacques de Hoop Scheffer sets a target of 2008 for the Afghan National Army to begin to take control of security. I would hope that by 2008, we will have made considerable progress, he says, with a more stable political architecture in place and with a strong interface between NATO and the civilian agencies and effective, trusted Afghan security forces gradually taking control. Leaders of the 26 countries agreed to remove some national restrictions on how, when, and where forces can be used. Remove some national restrictions. But friction continues. With violence against non-governmental aid workers increasing, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates criticized NATO countries in late 2007 for not sending more soldiers. Our progress in Afghanistan is real, but is fragile. Gates says, at this time, many allies are unwilling to share the risks, commit the resources, and follow through on collective commitments to this mission and to each other. As a result, we risk allowing what has been achieved in Afghanistan to slip away. May 2007, Taliban commander falls. A notorious Taliban military commander, Mullah Dadullah. Okay. So this guy is a notorious Taliban military commander. Is killed in a joint operation by Afghan U.S. NATO forces in the south of Afghanistan. Dadullah is believed to have been a leader of guerrilla forces in the war in Helmand province, deploying suicide bombers and ordering the kidnapping of Westerners. He once told the BBC that hundreds of suicide bombers awaited his command to launch an offensive against foreign troops. Okay. Collateral killings mount. Afghan and UN investigations find that errant fire from a U.S. gunship killed dozens of Afghan civilians in the Shindan district of Western Herat province, drawing condemnation from President Hamid Karzai and bolstering Taliban claims that coalition forces are unable to protect the population. So, as far as I'm aware, or rather, as far as this timeline says, this seems to be the first time that that civilians are killed. Now, probably there were others killed previous to this, but this is the first time it's mentioned. That coalition forces are unable to protect the population. U.S. military officials dispute the death toll in this incident, as well as claim that a separate incident in Farah province left as many as 140 civilians dead. After being named top U.S. commander in Afghanistan in mid-2009, General Stanley A. McChrystal orders an overhaul of U.S. air strike procedures. We must avoid the trap of winning tactical victories but suffering strategic defeats by causing civilian casualties or excessive damage and thus alienating the people, the general writes. February the 17th, 2009, Obama recommits to Afghanistan. New U.S. President Barack Obama announces plans to send 17,000 more troops to the war zone. Obama reaffirms campaign statements that Afghanistan is the more important U.S. front against terrorist forces. He says the United States will stick to a timetable to withdraw down most combat forces from Iraq by the end of 2011. As of January 2009, the Pentagon has 37,000 troops in Afghanistan, roughly divided between U.S. and NATO commands. Reinforcements focus on countering a resurgent Taliban and stemming the flow of foreign fighters over the Afghan-Pakistan border in the south. Speaking on the troop increase, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates describes the original mission in Afghanistan as too broad and calls for establishing limited goals such as preventing and limiting terrorist safe havens. March 27, 2009, the new American strategy. President Obama announces a new strategy for the war effort, linking success in Afghanistan to a stable Pakistan. The core goal of the strategy, as outlined in an interagency white paper, is to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat al-Qaeda and its safe havens in Pakistan and to prevent their return to Pakistan or Afghanistan. The strategy urges the passage of increased aid to Pakistan and a strict standard of measuring progress in fighting al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Plans also call for the deployment of an additional 4,000 troops to help train the Afghan army and police force. President Hamid Karzai of Afghanistan welcomes the strategy, stating that the plan will bring Afghanistan and the international community closer to success. A different call to NATO. Senior U.S. military officials and commanders altering course from the Bush administration call on NATO nations to supply non-military assets to Afghanistan. Officials stress the need for NATO members to step up in building Afghan civil society, such as providing resources for provincial reconstruction teams or PRTs. A two-day NATO summit in early April ends with the promise by NATO nations to send an additional 5,000 troops to train the Afghan army and police force and to provide security for the country's presidential election. Command change. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates replaces the top U.S. commander in Afghanistan. Replaces the top U.S. commander in Afghanistan, General David D. McKiernan, with counterinsurgency and special operations guru General Stanley A. McChrystal. McKiernan's removal comes 11 months after he assumed command of NATO forces in Afghanistan. Gates says the Pentagon needs fresh thinking and fresh eyes on the Afghanistan war. Comes 11 months after he assumed command of NATO forces. The Pentagon needs fresh thinking and fresh eyes in the Afghanistan war at a time when many analysts say operations that there are spiraling out of control. Reports indicate the appointment of McChrystal is intended to bring a more aggressive and innovative approach to the Afghan war effort in tune with a more focused counterinsurgency strategy. Got it. So the important thing here is that we're replacing the guy in charge. Okay. I'm just going to write this part down in the people know section. Okay. New strategy, old battles. U.S. Marines launch a major offensive in southern Afghanistan, representing a major test for the U.S. military's new counterinsurgency strategy. The offensive, involving 4,000 Marines, is launched in response to a growing Taliban insurgency in the country's southern provinces, especially Helmand province. The operation focused on restoring government services, bolstering local police forces, and protecting civilians from Taliban incursion. By August 2009, U.S. forces are to number between 60,000 and 68,000. Afghan presidential election. After more than 2 months of uncertainty, following a disputed presidential election on August 20th, President Hamid Karzai wins another term. The August 20th election, which pitted Karzai against top contenders Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani, was marred by fraud allegations. Oof. Okay, so this is not good if you've had 2 elections so far and both of them are marred by fraud allegations, especially when he was put in charge of the government like before it was democratically run. An investigation by the UN-backed Electoral Complaints Commission finds Karzai won only 49.67% of the vote, below the 50% plus 1 threshold needed to avoid a runoff. Under international pressure, Karzai agrees to a runoff vote on November 7th. But a week before the runoff, Karzai's main rival, Abdullah, pulls out and Karzai is declared the winner. Concerns over Karzai's legitimacy grow, and the United States and other international partners call for improved governance. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton ties all future civilian aid to greater efforts by the Karzai administration to combat corruption. Okay, so yeah, this is again, that's pretty bad when you got your runoff vote and then the main rival pulls out of the election. 9 months after renewing the U.S. commitment to the Afghan war effort, President Obama announces a major escalation of the U.S. mission. In a nationally televised speech, the president commits an additional 30,000 forces to the fight, on top of the 68,000 in place. These forces, Obama says, will increase our ability to train competent Afghan security forces and to partner with them so that more Afghans can get into the fight. And they will help create the conditions for the United States to transfer responsibility to the Afghans. For the first time in the 8-year war effort, a time frame is put on the U.S. military presence, as Obama says July 2011 as the start of a troop drawdown. But the president does not detail how long a drawdown will take. Obama says U.S. national interests are linked to success in the Afghan war effort, and argues that this temporary surge will force Afghan political and military institutions to assume responsibility for their own affairs. General McChrystal will relief from Afghan command. Wasn't this guy just put in? General Stanley McChrystal is relieved of his post as commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan following a controversial Rolling Stone article in which he and his aides were quoted criticizing the administration. Ooh. President Barack Obama nominates General David Petraeus. Oh, General Petraeus. Okay, this sounds familiar. Head of the Military Central Command and architect of the 2007 Iraq surge to replace McChrystal. Okay, so I'm going to write again this down. Put a space there for an extra event. The change in command comes at a crucial time in the war, as additional surge forces are scheduled to arrive ahead of its critical operation in Kandahar. Obama emphasizes his acceptance of McChrystal's resignation does not reflect disagreement over the counterinsurgency strategy he helped shape. We are in full agreement about our strategy, says Obama. This is a change in personnel, not a change in policy. Timetable for security transition. At a summit in Lisbon, NATO members countries signed a declaration agreeing to hand over full responsibility for security in Afghanistan to Afghan forces by the end of 2014. The transition process is set to begin in July 2011, with local security forces taking over control in relatively stable provinces and cities. The initial handover is to coincide with the start of a drawdown in the 100,000-strong contingent of U.S. troops deployed in Afghanistan, though the number of U.S. soldiers leaving is expected to be a token amount. But many in Afghanistan and the West, including members of the Afghan parliament, are concerned about the ability of national forces to take over from international troops. Okay, May 1st, 2011, Osama bin Laden is killed. So let me find Osama bin Laden again. It's May what? May 1st, 2011. On May 1st, 2011, Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, responsible for the 9/11 attacks in New York and in Washington, is killed by the U.S. forces in Pakistan. So he was in Pakistan. The death of America's primary target for a war that started 10 years ago fuels the long simmering debate about continuing the Afghanistan war. As President Obama prepares to announce the withdrawal of some or all of the 30,000 surge troops in July, congressional lawmakers increasingly call for a hastened drawdown of U.S. troops, though some analysts argue for a sustained military engagement. Meanwhile, anti-Pakistan rhetoric grows in Afghanistan, where officials have long blamed terrorist safe havens in Pakistan for violence in Afghanistan. Afghan President Hamid Karzai reiterates that international forces should focus their military efforts across the border in Pakistan. For years, we have said that the fight against terrorism is not in Afghan villages and houses, he says. Obama announces troop drawdown. President Obama outlines a plan to withdraw 33,000 troops by the summer of 2012, the surge troops sent in December 2009, including 10,000 by the end of 2011. Polls show a record number of Americans do not support the war, and Obama faces pressure from lawmakers, particularly Democrats, to sizably reduce U.S. forces in Afghanistan. After the surge troops leave, an estimated 70,000 U.S. troops are scheduled to stay through at least 2014. Obama confirms that the U.S. is holding preliminary peace talks with the Taliban leadership. With reconciliation in mind, the UN Security Council days earlier splits a sanctions list between members of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, making it easier to add and remove people and entities. Days earlier splits a sanctions list . Okay. Okay, so this looks like it's the first peace talks with Taliban. If anybody's in the chat, you can post something, just so I can see what anybody who's listening in is thinking. I'd be happy to do if somebody is actually in the chat, I'd be happy to do a quick rundown of what we're doing again. I hate this stupid. All right, well that's still loading, so I just can't take notes for a little bit. Okay. Okay. October 7, 2011, 10 years of war. The U.S. war in Afghanistan marks its 10th anniversary, with about 100,000 U.S. troops deployed in a counterinsurgency role, primarily in the southern and eastern regions. President Barack Obama plans to withdraw all combat troops by 2014. But serious doubts remain about the Afghan government's capacity to secure the country. Amid a resilient insurgency, U.S. goals in Afghanistan remain uncertain, and terrorist safe havens in Pakistan continue to undermine U.S. efforts. A decade in the war's tolls include 1,800 U.S. troop casualties and $444 billion in spending. The costs have eroded U.S. public support, the global economic downturn, a 9.1% unemployment rate, and a $1.3 trillion annual budget deficit. While there are military gains, hopes for a deal with the Taliban to help wind down the conflict remain riddled with setbacks. President Karzai suspends the talks following the September 20 assassination of Burhanuddin Rabbani, the government's chief negotiator, which Afghan officials blame on the Pakistan-based Haqqani network. The group denies it. Okay, so I'm just going to, again, copy that part down. Control Z. Bonn Conference. 10 years after the first international conference that discussed Afghanistan's political future, dozens of countries and organizations meet again in Bonn, Germany, to devise a roadmap of cooperation beyond the international troop withdrawal in 2014. Afghan President Hamid Karzai says the country will require $10 billion annually over the next decade to shore up security and reconstruction, and commits to tackling corruption in exchange for continued international assistance. The conference fails to achieve its objectives, to lay down a blueprint for Afghanistan's transition to a self-sustaining and secure government as the insurgency continues to rage, and Pakistan, a crucial player, refuses to attend. Now I see Angela Merkel's in attendance. March 2012, Taliban cancels talks, U.S.-Afghan tensions flare. In January, the Taliban strikes a deal to open an office in Qatar, a move towards peace talks with the United States sees as a move towards peace talks that the United States sees as a crucial part of a political settlement to ensure a stable Afghanistan. But 2 months later, the Taliban suspends preliminary talks, accusing Washington of reneging on promises to take meaningful steps toward a prisoner swap. In February, U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta announces the Pentagon's plan to conclude combat missions. U.S. Defense Secretary announces the Pentagon's plan to conclude combat missions by as early as mid-2013 and shift to a primarily security assistance role in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, several incidents serve as blows to the international mission, including an accidental burning of Qurans by U.S. troops. How do you accidentally burn Qurans? Serve as and allegations that a U.S. soldier murdered at least 16 Afghan villagers. What the hell? President Hamid Karzai demands that foreign troops be withdrawn from village outposts and confined to military bases, which analysts say would greatly accelerate the pace as transition from NATO to Afghan control. Afghan security takeover completed. Afghan forces take the lead in security responsibility nationwide as NATO hands over control of the remaining 95 districts. The U.S.-led coalition's focus shifts to military training and special operations-driven counterterrorism. The handover occurs on the same day as the announcement. The Taliban and U.S. officials resume talks in Doha, Qatar, where the Taliban has just opened an office. President Hamid Karzai, believing the office will confer legitimacy on the insurgent group and serve as diplomatic outposts, suspends negotiations with the United States. With its mandate expiring in December 2014, the United States must negotiate a bilateral security agreement with the Karzai government to maintain a military presence. Obama announces U.S. troop withdrawal, announces a timetable for withdrawing most U.S. Forces from Afghanistan by the end of 2016. The first phase of this plan calls for 9,000 U.S. troops to remain after the combat mission concludes at the end of 2014, limited to training Afghan forces and conducting operations against the remnants of al-Qaeda. Obama says that the withdrawdown will free resources for counterterrorism priorities elsewhere. Some analysts point to the insurgency's resilience and questions the plan's rigidity. Both candidates vying to succeed President Hamid Karzai have promised to sign the security agreement that is a prerequisite of any post-2014 U.S. troop assistance. Ghani and Abdullah agree to unity government. Ashraf Ghani, the newly elected president. Okay, so this guy's going to be important. Okay, the newly elected president signs a power-sharing agreement with his chief opponent, Abdullah, who had mobilized thousands of protesters as he challenged the voting results. The agreement... Okay. Okay. So the way that I read this is it's really weird that every election has been contested. And especially for a guy who's willing to like literally share power with his chief opponent. So there's that. The agreement, brokered after intensive diplomacy by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, establishes the role of chief executive for Abdullah. While the agreement staves off civil unrest, it ushers in protracted government dysfunction as Ghani and Abdullah tussle over their respective prerogatives, such as appointments to security posts, at a time when the Taliban are making gains in the countryside. Ghani, a former World Bank specialist, is a Pashtun from the country's south, like Karzai, but is seen by the Obama administration as a welcome change. Karzai had railed against civilian casualties in the U.S. war effort and was seen as fostering public corruption. 2017, April 13th, U.S. attacks Islamic State redoubt. The United States drops its most powerful non-nuclear bomb on suspected self-proclaimed Islamic State militants at a cave complex in eastern Nangarhar province. The weapon, known colloquially as the mother of all bombs, comes as newly elected President Donald Trump delegates decision-making authorities to commanders, including the possibility of adding several thousand U.S. troops to the nearly 9,000 already deployed there. There are about as many U.S. contractors as well. The bombing casts a spotlight on the emergence of the Islamic State in Afghanistan. Okay, so Islamic State is like another player. At the time, the Taliban appears to be as strong as ever, and the U.S. military describes the war as a stalemate. The bombing casts a spotlight in the emergence. And the U.S. military describes this war as a stalemate. Kabul experiences suicide bombings on a scale never before seen, while the Taliban control or contest more than a third of the country. U.S. Marines are once again dispatched to Helmand province. Trump signals prolonged Afghan war. President Trump outlines his Afghanistan policy in an address to troops in Arlington, Virginia, saying that though his original instinct was to pull out, he will instead press ahead with an open-ended military commitment to prevent the emergence of a vacuum for terrorists. Differentiating his policy from Obama's, Trump says decisions about withdrawal will be based on conditions on the ground rather than arbitrary timelines. He invites India to play a greater role in rebuilding Afghanistan while castigating Pakistan for harboring insurgents. Play a greater role in rebuilding. He also pledges to loosen restrictions on combat, even as the United Nations reports an uptick in civilian casualties caused by Afghan and coalition airstrikes. A political settlement with the Taliban, Trump says, is far off. 2018, Taliban launches major attacks amid U.S. escalation. The Taliban carry out a series of bold terror attacks in Kabul that kill more than 115 people amid a broader upsurge in violence. The attacks come as the Trump administration implements its Afghanistan plan, deploying troops across rural Afghanistan to advise Afghan brigades in launching airstrikes against opium labs to try to decimate the Taliban's finances. The administration also cuts off security assistance worth billions of dollars to Pakistan for what cuts off security... President Trump calls its lies and deceit in harboring Taliban militants. Critics of the National Unity Government say domestic politics, notably a shutdown with provincial governor, have distracted President Ghani from security. 2019, U.S. Taliban peace talks progress. Negotiations between the United States and the Taliban in Doha enter their highest level yet, building on momentum that began in late 2018. The talks between U.S. Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad and top Taliban official Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar center on the United States withdrawing its troops from Afghanistan, in exchange for the Taliban pledging to block international terrorist groups from operating on Afghan soil. The ramped-up diplomacy follows signals that President Trump plans to pull out 7,000 troops, about half the total U.S. deployment. Khalilzad says the United States will insist that the Taliban says the answer insisted the Taliban agreed to participate in an intra-Afghan dialogue on the country's political structure, as well as a ceasefire. It is unclear whether Trump will condition the troop withdrawal on those terms. President Trump abruptly breaks off peace talks a week after top U.S. negotiator Khalilzad announced that an agreement had been reached in principle with Taliban leaders. In a tweet, Trump says he canceled a secret meeting with the Taliban and Afghan President Ghani at Camp David after a U.S. soldier was killed in a Taliban attack. The Taliban says it's committed to continuing negotiations, but warns that the cancellation will cause an increase in the number of deaths. February 29, 2020, U.S. Taliban signed deal on path to peace. U.S. envoy Khalilzad and Taliban's Baradar signed an agreement that paves the way for a significant drawdown of U.S. troops in Afghanistan, includes guarantees from the Taliban the country will not be used for terrorist activities. The deal says intra-Afghan negotiations should begin the following month, but Afghan President Ghani says the Taliban must intra-Afghan negotiations should begin the following month. The Afghan President Ghani says Taliban must meet his government's own conditions before it enters talks. The U.S.-Taliban deal doesn't call for an immediate ceasefire, and in the days after its signing, Taliban fighters carry out dozens of attacks on Afghan security forces. U.S. forces respond with an airstrike against the Taliban in the southern province of Helmand. Intra-Afghan peace talks begin. Representatives of the Taliban and of the Afghan government and civil society meet face-to-face for the first time in Doha, Qatar, after nearly 20 years of war. And so meet face-to-face for the first time. The direct negotiations, which were delayed for months over a prisoner swap proposed in the earlier U.S.-Taliban deal, begin after the Afghan government completes the release of 5,000 Taliban prisoners. During opening remarks, both sides expressed eagerness to bring peace to Afghanistan and establish a framework for Afghan society after U.S. troops withdraw. The government pushes for a ceasefire, while the Taliban reiterates its call for the country to be governed through an Islamic system. U.S. announces troop withdrawal. After U.S. Defense Secretary Christopher C. Miller announces plans to have the number of troops in Afghanistan to 2,500 by mid-January, days before President Joe-elect will be inaugurated, thousands had already been pulled out following an agreement with the Taliban in February, moving closer to fulfilling President Trump's campaign promise to end the so-called forever wars. The announcement comes as negotiations between deadlocked, and the militant group continues to launch deadly attacks. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warns that withdrawing troops too early could allow Afghanistan to become a haven for terrorists and the Islamic State to rebuild its caliphate. April 14, 2021. Biden decides on complete U.S. withdrawal by 9/11. President Biden announces the United States will not meet the deadline set under the U.S.-Taliban agreement to withdraw all troops by May 1st, and instead releases a plan for a full withdrawal by September 11, 2021. It's time to end America's longest war, he says. The remaining 3,500 troops in Afghanistan will be withdrawn regardless of whether progress is made. Regardless of whether progress is made in intra-Afghan peace talks. Progress is made in intra-Afghan peace talks, or the Taliban reduces attacks on Afghan security forces and citizens. NATO troops in Afghanistan will also leave. Biden says Washington will continue to assist Afghan security forces and support the peace process. The Taliban says it will not participate in any conference on Afghanistan's future until all foreign troops leave. Afghan government collapses as Taliban takes Kabul. Facing little resistance, Taliban fighters overrun the capital, Kabul, and take over the presidential palace hours after President Ghani leaves the country. Taliban leaders say they will hold talks with Afghan officials to form an open, inclusive Islamic government. Former Afghan President Karzai and Abdullah, formerly the chief executive under Ghani, create a council to facilitate a peaceful transition to a Taliban government. The takeover follows the Taliban's rapid advance, during which it captured all but 2 of Afghanistan's provincial capitals and seized border crossings. Afghan security forces in some areas reported negotiated surrenders and avoided fighting the Taliban. Afghan security forces in some areas reportedly negotiated surrenders and avoided fighting the Taliban. Biden defends withdrawal. President Biden says his administration made the right decision ending the U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan, arguing the U.S. counterterrorism mission is complete. But he acknowledges that the troop withdrawal has been messy and blames Afghan security forces for failing to counter the Taliban. Meanwhile, the United States deploys 6,000 troops to evacuate U.S. and allied personnel and secure Kabul's international airport, where chaos erupts as thousands of Afghans attempt to flee. Biden says the military will help evacuate thousands of Afghans who worked with the United States, and he expands refugee status access for vulnerable Afghans. 13 U.S. service members killed amid scramble to withdraw. 13 U.S. service members killed amid scramble to withdraw. Are killed, and at least 18 are injured in an attack at a checkpoint outside the Kabul airport, where thousands of people are being evacuated. They are the first U.S. service members killed in action in Afghanistan since February 2020. At least 60 Afghans are also killed and dozens more injured in the attacks. President Biden vows to take action against the Islamic State in Khorasan, which claims responsibility, and to continue the evacuation at least until the August 31st troop withdrawal deadline. Okay. So, conclusions. How do I want, what are my conclusions exactly? Okay, thought process. It kind of seemed like the war was just going poorly, especially because of Pakistan and Pakistan's refusal to get soldiers out. It feels like at some point you either have to give up or you have to basically launch a full war on both Afghanistan or the Taliban forces in Afghanistan and the Pakistan, which just seems really hard. Yeah. I'm trying to think of what Biden could have done differently. The big thing that I've heard some people say is that maybe he should have withdrawn civilians sooner. Yeah, at which point you're basically admitting that the Afghanistan government was completely incompetent the entire time, which feels really bad. So I don't really know how that would work. Yeah. There was also a really good YouTube video I thought I saw. Okay, so let's see here. Let's just look up Afghanistan on YouTube. I had a really good video that I was going to review. Just reading a couple of headlines. U.S. Afghan allies could be stranded in Afghanistan for years, according to international experts. Taliban spokesman responds to Biden's move. Americans know the Biden admin is lying about Afghanistan. Taliban hang 4 bodies from cranes in Afghanistan. Call it lesson for kidnappers. Afghanistan bomb blast hits Taliban convoy. I think it was this video. It might have been this video. Yes. Okay. I was definitely watching this before. Okay, so this is going to be...
Afghanistan has been in the news this week following a complete takeover.
So again, this is a YouTube channel, so bias, don't know, but YouTube. All right.
Over by the Taliban armed group. I've talked about this before on the channel, looking at the American plan to withdraw and being skeptical about the process, and now it seems that our worst fears have come true, as the Taliban, starting in early May, launched an offensive that soon gained ground, and by early August they'd taken over the majority of the country. Then they attacked the provincial capitals, and finally they surrounded and captured Kabul on the 15th of August. This came after a 2-decade-long military presence of what many consider to be the best armed forces in the world, that of the United States, as well as many international allies, including NATO. It's cost around $1 trillion, much of which has been put into the armed forces, but also into the establishment of a civilian government in Afghanistan. And yet, with the withdrawal of a large amount of these forces, at the first sign of a Taliban offensive, it crumbled and has fallen. And the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, controlled by the Taliban, has been declared. And what took around 100,000 Afghan lives, thousands of international soldiers' lives, around $1 trillion, and 2 decades to create and to protect, was lost in the space of only 3 months. The question on everyone's lips is, how has this happened? For a quick introduction into who the Taliban are and what their origins are, then do check out my video on the Taliban, the 5-minute history. Although in this video I want to focus more.
All right, I'm going to watch that first real quick. From this guy, that might actually be super helpful. Bear in mind, I do not know who this guy is. I'll post the, I think this is the same link. So the channel's name is History with Hilbert. Wow, YouTube is just being so incredibly slow today. Or my computer in general, I guess. The Taliban offensive. Okay, History with Hilbert. Okay, so I'm just going to watch this first. Who are the Taliban in 5 minutes? Real quick, my understanding is basically that the Taliban are just an Islamic group in Afghanistan, and they're like very fundamentalist Islam.
Who are the Taliban? The Taliban are a terrorist organization that is associated mainly with the country of Afghanistan. The name Taliban is itself an Arabic loanword into the Pashto language and means students, the singular being talib. They were founded after the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which set up a communist system inside the country. Many Afghans were unhappy with this and fought back against the Soviets. They were known as the Mujahideen, another Arabic word which means along the lines of the defenders of the faith. As they were fighting the Russians, they became natural allies with the Americans, who were in the grip of the Cold War, who aided, financed, and armed the Mujahideen in the fight against the Soviets. As the years went on, the violence only worsened. While the men fought against the Soviets, many of the women and children fled to neighboring Pakistan, where they were destitute, and the only way out for many of the young men, or the children at the time, was to go into madrasa, religious schools. It's here that the ISI, which is the Inter-Services Intelligence, saw a way of using the situation to their advantage. And this is where, in 1994, they started to train some of these boys in religious schools in combat tactics and radical forms of Islam. This would be the origin of the Taliban. In the meantime, the Soviet-backed government was left on its own by the Russians as they pulled out, and this was soon replaced by a Mujahideen government, although this didn't last long, and soon by 1992, there was a civil war going on, and by 1994, the Taliban had entered the scene. By this time, the Taliban seemed almost foreign to Afghanistan, speaking a strange dialect of the Pashto language they'd picked up in Pakistan, as well as adhering to a different form of Islam. But what they did bring was order and ruthless efficiency, which was something that the Afghan people needed after decades of war. And so in 1996, the Taliban were able to establish control over much of Afghanistan and capture the capital Kabul, setting up the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The Taliban followed an incredibly strict rule of law, imposing the death penalty for certain crimes, as well as amputation and an implementation of Sharia. They also banned higher education for women and imposed stricter laws on them, such as wearing the full face veil. The sect of Islam followed by the Taliban leadership was called Deobandism, which had been started in India, but after its partition, it had become largely isolated in Pakistan. And thanks to radicals from Saudi Arabia who funded the madrasa in which the Taliban were formed, it became an increasingly radical form of Islam, which they adhered to. At the same time, they also followed Pashtunwali, which is essentially being Pashtun, which is one of the larger ethnic groups in Afghanistan, and it's largely among the Pashtun that they have their support. Their radical Islamism brought them in connection with Al-Qaeda, and they allowed the group to use Afghanistan for training bases. And this is when, after the September 11th attacks in 2001, Taliban-controlled Afghanistan was invaded by the United States, who refused to give up the Al-Qaeda training camps that were stationed in the country. This, of course, would bring down to the downfall of the Taliban, although many of them were able to escape into neighboring Pakistan with the help of their intelligence service, who had founded the group in 1994. From 2002 onwards, the Taliban created an insurgency inside the country and slowly regained control over large parts of the countryside. Several factors contributed to the resurgence of the Taliban in these years, one of which was the small number of NATO troops thinking that their enemy had been defeated, the drug trade which allowed them to pump money through the opium seeds in Afghanistan, as well as the continued support from tribal and other religious leaders throughout the country, all allowed the Taliban to go from strength to strength, as did the general feeling of the Afghan population that they had been invaded once again. The Taliban also upgraded their tactics using improvised explosive devices and guerrilla tactics, as well as suicide bombings, which a shift occurred in 2006 to great effect and made it very hard for the NATO troops to fight against them. The attempt to create a state of Afghanistan was marred by corruption, and its army has proved to be incredibly poor at fighting back against the Taliban. It was estimated in 2016 that around 20% of Afghanistan was under the control of the Taliban, particularly in the south, and this led to the United States entering direct negotiations with the group in Qatar, and in 2020 it led to the signing of what was called a peace deal between the two that did not involve the government of Afghanistan. And as such, with United States and NATO forces rapidly pulling out of the country, in 2021 the Taliban have been on their most deadly and successful offensive since 2001, and they now control around 60% of Afghanistan. And just today, when I've been recording this video, the news has reached us that Kunduz, which is the second largest city in the country, has today fallen to the Taliban. So many are now asking themselves of how long this modern state of Afghanistan will continue without NATO support, and whether there will be another state emerging like the one that was seen from 1996 with all the ruthlessness that the Taliban showed then. But I sincerely hope that this is not what we'll see.
Okay, so that gives us a decent idea of who the Taliban are. Most of that isn't totally new. We kind of knew about the connection between the Taliban and the Mujahideen from another video, but
on what happened from September of 2020, because I think the current fall of Afghanistan can be linked directly to the United States peace deal that was signed with the Taliban in Doha in 2020, and which I made an earlier video about as well. What's important to remember about this deal is that it was made by the Trump administration at the time, so the United States, and representatives of the Taliban. It did not include the Afghan government in any way, shape, or form, and many members of that government were highly critical of the deal that had been signed. The deal stipulated the conditions upon which the Americans would leave Afghanistan completely. In exchange, the Americans released 5,000 Taliban prisoners that were being kept in Afghan prisons. This led to many experts, often seasoned battle commanders, being handed over to the Taliban on the vague promise of the Taliban to reduce their violence and not to target American personnel in Afghanistan, the second of which they did, the first of which they certainly did not. The effect of releasing what were often very experienced soldiers back to the Taliban is that it greatly reinforced not only their numbers, but also their capability and the experience in their ranks. Furthermore, it was an incredible morale booster for the Taliban and was widely criticized by the Afghan military and Afghan politicians, who were continually seen as being inept and not able to deal with the Taliban. It also served in a large part to legitimize the Taliban, as the Americans had dealt directly with spokesmen from their organization and had completely sidelined the Afghan government, which had been made to look inept in the wake of an agreement between what was a world superpower and essentially an armed Islamist militia. On the 1st of May 2021, the date that American soldiers were supposed to leave Afghanistan, the Taliban started their offensive in the country. However, the Americans, instead of backing down on their side of the deal, and started militia. On the 1st of May 2021, the date that American soldiers were supposed to leave Afghanistan, the Taliban started their offensive in the country. However, the Americans, instead of backing down on their side of the deal and refusing to leave, decided to continue with the withdrawal of US soldiers, which they said would be complete by the historic date of the 11th of September. But it was far from a foregone conclusion. After all, the Taliban offensive would be against the Afghan armed forces that had been trained and funded by the Americans and other NATO powers for around 20 years. They numbered around 350,000 strong and were armed with the best equipment available to them, whereas the Taliban were often in the back of Toyotas with Kalashnikovs and some basic machine guns without the military training and expertise of the United States, and only numbered around 70,000 men. So then how did it go so wrong for the Afghan army? The frequently cited figure that the Afghan National Army was made up of 350,000 men needs to be reanalyzed, as a large part of this number isn't actually of the armed forces, but rather of police forces and other law enforcement agencies, rather than the actual army itself. And in fact, of that number, only around 185,000 belonged to an effectively equipped armed force that could put up a fight against the Taliban. Of this number, it's estimated that only around 60% had received their full basic training by the time of the Taliban offensive. This is for reasons that I'll get into in just a moment. There's also a very large problem with ghost battalions in the Afghan National Army.
Not missing, just hiding in the paperwork.
These occur when battalions are ordered to be raised to bolster the national defense, but instead the commanders simply pocket the money that is meant to be assigned to paying soldiers' salaries and equipment for themselves, and so these troops don't exist either, even though they do exist in the paperwork. Corruption of this kind is incredibly common through all levels of what is now the former Afghan government, and this has certainly played an important role in the downfall and the weakness of the Afghan armed forces in the face of this recent Taliban assault. This also played into the fact that a lot of the equipment that was meant to go to these Afghan soldiers, very high-tech American equipment that should have given them a great edge over the Taliban, was actually sold onto the black market, both by soldiers themselves, but more frequently by commanders who would turn a profit. And of course, who are the ones that are buying these weapons and equipment on the Afghan black market? None other than the Taliban themselves. And so all that American money and equipment and weapons, ammunition that meant to be going to stopping the Taliban actually ended up in their hands before they'd even captured a single district from the Afghans they were fighting. And these problems were only exacerbated by the American withdrawal. Initially, it had been the Pentagon's responsibility to directly pay the wages of the Afghan National Army soldiers. However, with the American withdrawal, this responsibility was shifted to the government in Kabul, and lo and behold, the salaries of the soldiers didn't arrive into, well, probably not their bank accounts, but into their pockets. They were siphoned off by politicians and army commanders higher up the line. Of course, this does nothing for morale when the pay doesn't come in. But it wasn't only pay that didn't make it out to the Afghan National Army soldiers at their outposts and in their barracks. At times, it was even the very ammunition that they needed to fight back against the Taliban, and they were complaining of being desperately short of ammunition. Part of this, again, goes back to the black market, and others are failures in the logistics of the Afghan system as the United States pulled out. They also often lacked food as they were unable to get supplies to forward bases. The reasons why I will explain in just a second, but this all led to a worsening morale among the Afghan National Army soldiers and a feeling that they were not being protected and supplied for by the government in Kabul due to the rampant corruption that was happening at all levels of the system. Given these factors, it's no surprise to learn that desertion is or was a huge problem for the Afghan National Army, and that actually desertion rates were as high as 1 in 4 in the Afghan National Army's ranks over several years. While the problem has been worse since the news of the American withdrawal, these problems have actually existed in the Afghan National Army for as long as it's been around, and they have never been addressed. The low morale and frequent desertion rates in the Afghan National Army aren't only down to the poor communication systems, corruption, and the failure of pay to get through to them, which has only been a problem really since the Americans started to pull out. This is something that several US commanders did indeed notice, but these problems were nonetheless not addressed. As the former US General Wesley Clark explains, the truth is that these people in Afghanistan have been through this before. This is a country that's been at war for 40 years. People signed up with the Afghan military to make money. They fired their weapons. Did they want to die in service of the Afghan military? Remember, Afghanistan is not a conventional nation. It's really tribal, and so they were earning a paycheck. Some of them didn't even get that paycheck, but they didn't sign up to fight to the death for the most part. He goes on to say, this is an old Afghan trait. They go with the winners, or at least they run away from the losers, and that's why it happens so quickly. Now, whether that could have been anticipated or not, we'll just have to wait and see. With the Americans at their side, they didn't mind fighting alongside them to earn their paycheck, or even really to keep the country out of the hands of the Taliban. But as Joe Biden said in one of his speeches, they have to want to fight. And the reason they wanted to fight was because the Americans were the winners. Without the Americans, they realized that the Afghan government was not going to be one of the winners. And that's one of the reasons why the army crumbled so quickly. And it wasn't only the Afghan National Army that felt the impact of the American announcement of withdrawal. The Afghan National Air Force, which was meant to keep the Taliban at bay by providing bombing runs and surveillance, being able to supply more remote locations, also faced a great challenge with the American withdrawal. Not in the least because the Americans also pulled out their logistics. Initially, it was only meant to be US soldiers that were pulled out. Biden proceeded to pull out all Americans on the ground completely, and this involved the logistics that the Afghans relied upon for a functioning air force. So while they had some of the most up-to-date Black Hawk helicopters and others from the United States that could really have made a difference fighting the Taliban, once they were broken, they didn't have the means or the skills or the technicians to repair them themselves, and so they lay on the ground and were completely useless to the Afghan Air Force. And this basically gave up their biggest advantage against the Taliban, which was that the Taliban didn't have any air power whatsoever. This could really have made a difference, but they were unable to utilize this advantage against them because of this failure in logistics with the American pullout, and because the Afghans themselves didn't have the skills required to keep it going without that American support that was sucked out of the country. A quick word from today's sponsor, Ground News. Now, as you can imagine, with a political topic like this, I ended up looking at a lot of different news sources. And the problem with the algorithms we have online is that if you click on, let's say, a left-wing take on something, hey, that it shows you bias. See every sound. Don't check it out. Look at so you don't get trapped in that same media bubble. Aside from the Afghan government and the Taliban, there is also a third source of political and military power in the form of various warlords that exist inside the country and can call up armed men to their banner. It's important to remember that Afghanistan is still essentially an incredibly tribal country, and this is at the root of a lot of what is going on at the minute, as we saw with several parts of the Afghan army that are often more loyal to their tribal association than they are to the country and sometimes to the distant capital and government in Kabul. Now, a lot of the time, these warlords belong to a particular tribe and can call up men from this tribe or from a larger ethnicity to fight for their tribal or ethnic interest, which they will change depending on where that interest aligns. And this can constantly shift, as was seen during the 1990s. Now, to give an incredibly oversimplified map of the different ethnicities within Afghanistan, the largest these ethnicities are themselves split into different groups and different tribes that are often at war with one another and at war with other ethnicities in shifting alliances. These warlords essentially make the best of this to gain power for themselves and to normally protect the interests of their tribe or sometimes larger ethnic group at the expense of others. Now, the Taliban are largely made up of individuals from the Pashtun majority in Afghanistan, and they also pursue a theory called Pashtunwali, which is like the culture of being a Pashtun. And so when the Taliban were in power, they often oppressed the other minorities within Afghanistan. And this is why many of the leading warlords in Afghanistan today are from the minorities that were traditionally oppressed by the Taliban. So Ismail Khan and Ahmad Massoud and Atta Muhammad Noor, these are all Tajiks, while Abdul Rashid Dostum is an Uzbek. But these often fought against one another. So, for example, Atta Muhammad Noor actually ousted Abdul Rashid Dostum, and they often fight against one another, but they did also unite to fight against the Taliban. But it's important to remember that the Taliban were only able to take power because in 1994, when these various warlords had united and driven out the Soviets, they turned their guns on one another and started the Afghan Civil War, which from 1996, the Taliban were able to seize power. In 1996, however, the Taliban didn't actually take over all of Afghanistan, and these warlords continued in part to fight back against them and became known as the Northern Alliance, controlling around 10% of Afghanistan in the very north. In 2001, when the United States and NATO invaded, they were the key allies on the ground that aided them in doing so. But the United States and indeed the new Afghan government soon found out that they were incredibly unreliable bedfellows. And for instance, in 2002, when one warlord wasn't made the governor of a particular district, he attacked the city by shelling it. So that's the kind of individuals that the warlords are. Incredibly difficult to get on with, but the early Afghan government had to rely on these warlords for regional stability. And people who were in 1999 called warlords in 2001 became governors, politicians, etc., and became part of the new government. And in fact, the first president, Hamid Karzai, was himself one of the Mujahideen who had raised money to fight against the Soviets and was a warlord from the Kandahar region who had fought against the Taliban during the United States invasion. Another, who I've already mentioned, Abdul Rashid Dostum, became the vice president despite having a very murky record on human rights and, as I said, having fought against other warlords after the defeat of the Taliban. After 2004, however, when a lot of money had been pumped into the government and it looked a bit more stable and the Taliban seemed to be completely defeated, the reliance on these old warlords decreased and the Afghan government took a lot of power from them in an attempt to centralize the government around Kabul, something that the United States was also incredibly in favor of. And this involved them demobilizing their small armies, as well as having to relinquish control over a lot of the financial assets of particular districts. This was, of course, taxation, as the central government in Kabul took over these responsibilities and extended its power at the cost of these warlords. But this can't be used to explain why the warlords didn't put up much of a resistance in this newest Taliban offensive, because in 2014, a lot of these militias were revived by the government as the United States started preparing to level back their military involvement, and the Afghan government needed more men. And so there was a system in place for these militias, should they be needed, to be called upon, and indeed they were called upon now as well. Part of the blame, I think, has to go to the president, Ashraf Ghani, who, unlike Hamid Karzai, had an incredibly poor relationship with the warlords, often refusing to meet them and insulting them, and not having a very good relationship and understanding that they were, in fact, an important element of defense should it be needed. And although in the last week he did call a meeting of several warlords and met with them to try and raise these militias, I think this personal dislike between Ashraf Ghani and the warlords may have soured the air enough that the warlords decided not to rise up as they had done before and as they might have done with more presidential support. The fate of these various warlords following this Taliban offensive is really quite different. Ismail Khan, for example, who was referred to as the Lion of Herat and was in Western Afghanistan, held out against the Taliban in the 1990s for a very long time and was a famed fighter against them. While he did mount resistance in Herat in August as well, he was defeated after only a few days of fighting and has now apparently joined with the Taliban after he was captured. Although how much this was him actually being captured and going over to the Taliban side, or whether there was a pre-arranged agreement for him to do so and to maintain a certain amount of power in the region is unknown. Because, of course, for the Taliban, who are seeking to establish a government, certain regions in the north will be equally difficult for them to control, as it was for the incumbent Afghan government in 2001. And so they may also be seeking to bring warlords over to their side rather than eliminating them outright. And as we saw in the 1990s, the warlords were more than willing to switch sides when it favored them. Abdul Rashid Dostum and Atta Muhammad Noor are traditional enemies, and it's thought that Ashraf Ghani, in some of the last days he was president, was trying to broker a peace between them, as they both were important warlords in the region of Mazar-e-Sharif, one of the most important cities in the very north of Afghanistan and the gateway to neighboring Uzbekistan. Both were famous for their dogged resistance against the Taliban in the 1990s, although it should be noted that Dostum briefly also worked with them. And so it goes to show that actually there's not much of a moral or a cause-oriented basis to who they fight for, but again, that it's largely based on situation and who the winners seem to be and how they can best hold on to their piece of land and what's best for their tribe and their ethnic group at the time. And indeed, despite all of the bravado that they showed beforehand, it came to nothing and they fled into neighboring Uzbekistan with the fall of Mazar-e-Sharif itself. Now, why did the warlords fall so easily? Well, one explanation might be that the Afghan National Army, for the reasons already explained, just crumbled incredibly quickly, and that the warlords themselves didn't have the manpower to provide defense for the regions they held without the Afghan National Army, and that because that was so quickly defeated or surrendered without actually fighting back against the Taliban, the warlords had no option and fled themselves. That's one option. At the same time, there is also the very real possibility that the local people upon whom they relied for their recruits and for food and for money at the same time, and also would not be sold out to the Taliban themselves, were not really looking forward to more years under the dogged rule of another warlord, as this had been a period in the 90s that had seen incredible hardship for these people, as the warlords were able to just run ragged over the population in the areas they controlled. And it's quite possible that without the support of the Afghan people, that they simply couldn't function anymore and saw that the battle was up, especially if the Taliban, who had been in these areas for many years, had established relationships with them already. There is also another possibility, and it's a bit of a conspiracy theory, and there's no real evidence for this, but potentially this has also played into it, and that is that these warlords often fall prey to foreign influence, as these foreign powers often sought to use them to fight their own proxy wars within Afghanistan and to spread their influence. And Abdul Rashid Dostum, it's not a big secret that he is indeed on the payroll of the Turkish government, and it's known that he was recently in Ankara. Quite possibly what was discussed there was the eventuality of a Taliban takeover. Turkey has not ruled out that it might recognize a Taliban-run Afghanistan in the future, and has reportedly been in contact with the militant group, which it said was a positive message. And so it is possible that Turkey anticipated what was happening. They indeed had a lot of troops on the ground as part of the NATO withdrawal, still have many Turkish soldiers at Kabul airport that are helping with the evacuation of civilians there. So it's possible that they advised Dostum on the situation and that it might not be the end of his story there. And so perhaps the failure of his resistance wasn't entirely down to the brilliance of the Taliban on the battlefield. And it should also be noted that in 1996, one of the groups that was most targeted by the Taliban after they took over were the Hazara. Now, the Hazara, unlike the Taliban and most others inside the country of Afghanistan, they occupy the central north of the country, is that they are Shia Muslims, while the Taliban worship a form of Sunni Islam, as do most other Muslims. Now, the fact that they are Shia gives Muslims inside the country of Afghanistan, they took over that entirely down to the brilliance of the Taliban on the battlefield. And it should also be noted that in 1996, one of the groups that was most targeted by the Taliban after they took over were the Hazara. Now, the Hazara, unlike the Taliban and most others inside the country of Afghanistan, they occupy the central north of the country, is that they are Shia Muslims, while the Taliban worship a form of Sunni Islam, as do most other Muslims. Now, the fact that they are Shia gives a natural ally to them in neighboring Iran, which is also a majority Shia country and has a very Shia government, and they indeed supported the Hazara and various warlords that were there. However, in recent times, Iran has been incredibly positive about the Taliban takeover in the country, as of course the wider geopolitics is that the Taliban victory has weakened the United States, which is one of the great enemies of Iran. And so it's possible that Iran is also open to recognizing the Taliban in their position in Afghanistan, and there does seem to have been a rather large shift between the attitude of Iran towards the Taliban in the 1990s compared with now. We held on for as long as we could. We asked for more ammunition and reinforcement, but no one came. The situation was getting worse as the Taliban were getting closer. They were no longer using just Kalashnikov rifles, but were armed with heavy weapons and Humvees. Private Salangi, African National Army, Farah province. On the 1st of May 2021, the Taliban started their offensive in Afghanistan. Before the offensive, they already controlled 73 of around 300 different districts in Afghanistan. And these were largely the rural, mountainous, often sparsely populated districts in the country. And as the offensive wore on, they basically captured more provinces or more districts like this. And I was following the situation quite closely and continually heard different Afghan officials saying, yes, they are making gains, but these are largely the remote and the unimportant, the sort of backwater districts that will be recaptured easily and won't give them much advantage at all. But this was completely wrong, because in fact, over the years of the 2 decades that the Taliban had been an insurgent force in Afghanistan, it was in these precise rural areas where they could lever their power over the population, where they could hide among the common people, and where they would not be found by the forces that were looking for them, and from where they mounted their guerrilla campaign against them. And so they knew exactly what they were doing in precisely these rural districts. And because they were being ignored, the fact they were making gains was not taken seriously. And indeed, it was the fact that they didn't take any major cities until much later in their campaign that played precisely into their hands in what they were trying to achieve. Because it was in the rural districts that they were able to get money, they were able to tax the local population and utilize the poppy seeds for earning an income from the drug market, as well as gaining the supplies and the food they needed, whilst at the same time depriving the Afghan army of these resources that gave them the edge. Furthermore, it was in these areas that they were able to bring over the local population to their side, as they had been active in these rural areas for a long time. By bringing tribal elders onto their side, the Taliban are able to more effectively cut off these outposts of the Afghan National Army, who, due to the failures with the Afghan National Air Force, are not being able to be resupplied by air when the Taliban were surrounding and cutting off these various outposts in the more remote districts, which is what they repeatedly did on in the campaign. And this led to so many of them surrendering, as the Afghan National Army forces didn't see any way that they would be resupplied and reinforced from Kabul. And with each surrender, the Taliban gained more armored vehicles like the American Humvees and more high-tech weaponry that the Afghan National Army had surrendered to them. But much more important than the equipment and the weapons that they captured was what they captured with the phones in their pockets, because the Taliban are no longer simply the bearded, turban-wearing Osama bin Laden helping fiends from the 1990s, because now almost every Taliban fighter also has a smartphone in his pocket, and with these they took videos every time that they would capture Afghan National Army outposts, and these videos circulate so much on Afghan social media that other soldiers would see them and would believe that the war had been lost, that there were so many soldiers surrendering, but it must mean that the Taliban were incredibly powerful and they weren't able to fight back. But also the Taliban were very clever, and while there have been some instances, especially of the more elite commando units and commanders being executed after surrender, that in the videos they showed them embracing and kissing one another and giving off the impression that if they simply surrendered, then they and their families would be fine. And this came at the same time as a wave of assassinations of Air Force pilots and other commanders and threats to families of higher ups in the army that the Taliban were making. And so many Afghan soldiers, because of seeing these videos, got the impression that the war was going far worse than it actually was. And this had the rippling effect that the more of these places were taken and the more videos the Taliban were taking of these surrenders that seemingly were peaceful, even jovial looking, with a lot of sheepish laughs from the Afghan troops that are surrendering and seeming camaraderie between them, the more frequently that other Afghan army outposts would simply surrender without firing a single shot because they thought it was their best bet. They, of course, hadn't been paid for many months and they didn't really want to die for a state that they didn't really believe in. And I think this is why you see this cascading effect of these outer regions being captured, and then suddenly in August, when the offensive has been underway for a little time, this sense of defeat has just set in. And it's quite possible that this sense that the Taliban was sweeping to victory was also felt among many of the common rural people who maybe just wanted the war to stop. It's also possible to gain an understanding of the broader strategy of Afghanistan when looking at a map of where its major cities are and where the Taliban made its gains during the offensive. As I mentioned previously, they didn't immediately start attacking the larger cities because they were walking a fine tightrope between advancing enough in their offensive to put pressure on the Afghan government, but not doing anything so much so that it might draw the Americans back into the conflict, which didn't occur. And this is very clear to the Taliban because Biden continued with the plan to pull out, despite the fact that the Taliban were clearly not keeping their side of the agreement that had been reached in Doha in scaling back their attacks. What appears to happen is that the Taliban focused on attacking rural areas surrounding major cities, and this is a development that is clear by the start of August. And while Herat and Lashkar and Kandahar and Kunduz and Mazar-e Sharif are all surrounded by districts controlled by the Taliban, they hadn't actually yet entered these cities. They were just completely surrounded by those areas that had been captured by the Taliban. What becomes clearer when we look is that a key moment in the Taliban offensive is the early on capture of this district to the north of Kabul, because this is where the main and only real highway goes between Kabul and the various cities to the north of Kunduz, Mazar-e Sharif, as well as the west in Herat. And the Taliban captured it very early on, and this meant that the Afghan government were not able to send reinforcements over land to these various places because of the Taliban capture. We've already talked about how poor the Air Force was faring at the time, and so the Taliban effectively cut off Kabul from the north from important resources, as well as those northern cities from the military in Kabul itself. We also see that the Taliban very strategically focused on gaining access to the most important border crossings with the neighboring countries. This further served to cut off parts of the country from being resupplied from the neighboring states themselves, as these points that are highlighted are where the major highways connect Afghanistan to its neighbors. The Taliban capturing this severely crippled the movement of the Afghan army inside the country, as well as trade and financial aid it might otherwise have received from the countries around it. And there were actually reports from several Afghan soldiers that some of the Taliban that they fought against were heard speaking different foreign languages. Now, I wasn't able to find which precise languages these were, but it wouldn't surprise me if these were Central Asian people from some of the countries that surround Afghanistan and have been involved in other Islamist movements that came over from their side of the border to support the Taliban. So it may be the case that these border districts didn't only fall on the Afghan side, but that they were aided from the other side by non-state actors as well. A final interesting point that I want to touch on is that they focused their attention on gaining land in the north. And this was particularly surprising and caught the Afghan government off guard, because this region that is circled was the part of Afghanistan that in the 90s didn't fall to the Taliban and continued to resist under the Northern Alliance. But this time around, it fell fairly easily to the Taliban, despite historically having been a bastion of anti-Taliban sentiment. So it may be the case that there is some underhand politics going on, either that or that the warlords were significantly weakened in this area after Ashraf Ghani's government, or that there is indeed something more to the story that we don't yet know. Thank you all very much for tuning in to watch this video on what's recently happened in Afghanistan, the Taliban takeover, and some of the reasons why I think that it went the way that it did, and why it caught quite a few people by surprise. Let me know if you agreed with this analysis and if you have more information.
Okay. Thank you for joining me, I guess.